Hello. Welcome.
You can hear me clap once.
Hello, everybody.
You can hear me clap twice. You can hear me clap 3 times. Do this, y'all.
Welcome. We're glad that you're able to join us today for a talk on race and fiber culture. The event is hosted by the Center for Information Technology and Public Life here at the University of North Carolina as part of our Spring Speaker Series. I'm Catherine Peters, CTAP's Executive Director. CTAP is dedicated to understanding the growing impact of the internet, social media, and other forms of digital information in the context of the people who design, use, and govern. We're especially interested in people, platforms, and power. Our research takes a holistic approach to studying technology, focused on how social inequality and power structures shape deployment and impact. We're committed to equality and justice in our scholarship. In that spirit, I'd like to take a moment to consider the legacy of colonization in our technology society. Our center occupies the ancestral land of many native, including but not limited to the Shakori, Eno, Tuscarora, and Lumpy, and remains home to the Occaneechi band of the Pony Nation. The university was funded in its early years from the sale of lands that were home to the Cherokee and Chickasaw Nation. I invite you to join me in acknowledging our shared responsibility to pursue reconciliation and justice in our time here today. We're honored to host Dr. Andre Brock. After his talk, we'll hold a QA session. For those of you joining us remotely who would like to get in the question and answers, you can submit your questions via email to ctap@unc.edu, CITAP@unc.edu. To introduce our speaker, I'll turn the microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Shannon McGregor, assistant professor here in the Hudson School of Journalism and Media, and a senior researcher at CTAP.
Great, thank you. So I'm really excited to host Dr. Andre Brock here today. We were brainstorming our spring speaker series, and Andre was at the very, very tippy top of our excited about, and please can we get you here list. Dr. Brock is an associate professor in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Institute of Technology. He's one of the preeminent scholars of Black cyber culture, bridging STS studies and critical discourse analysis, thinking about, examining, and showing how the communicative affordances of online media align with the communities of Black practices and Black communication practices. He publishes articles on racial representation in video games, Black women in web blogs, whiteness, Blackness, and digital technoculture, as well as path-breaking research on Black Twitter. He's the author of Distributed Blackness, African American Cyber Cultures, published by NYU Press, which many of us read here at CTAP as part of our summer book club last summer. In it, he offers insights towards understanding how Black folks' everyday lives are mediated by network technologies, and I think really critically bringing intervention of realness and joy into the scholarship area. Dr. Brock is also a methodological pioneer, explicating critical technocultural discourse analysis, which, at least from a survey of my own graduate students, is a methodology that is going to be well taken up and well cited in our future scholarship here in communication. This type of analysis combines analyses of information technology, material, and virtual design with an inquiry into the production of meaning through information technology practice, and the articulations of information technology users in situ. So please join me in person and online in welcoming Dr. Andre Brock at UNC.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I need your energy to sustain me on this day where Andre is singing for his supper. I just completed a 3-hour workshop that I really enjoyed, and I hope to bring that same enjoyment to you with this nerdy ass, intellectual talk on anti-racism, which comes from my book. But first, let me thank Shannon McGregor for inviting me out last night. I actually saw Shannon. Her doctorate was still wet, and now she's a mass associate professor. But also, I'm really happy to see Alice Marwick and Daniel Priest, who are people I enjoy talking to and working with, and my collaborators, Kiara Childs and Zari Taylor, right? Plus all the cool people that I met so far, and hopefully. So today's talk pulls from some concepts that I began to consider in Distributed Blackness, my first book, my last book, University Press. And my goal was to unpack what Black technology use or Black technoculture would look like from the perspective of Black folk without resorting to deficit models, commodification concerns, resistance, or Black pathology. One outcome of this inquiry, because if you're conceptualizing race and Blackness, you have to consider the matrix in which it was constructed and created. One outcome of this inquiry was an effort in the middle of the book to theorize algorithmic racism as manifested on social media, as a way of understanding the harms that these algorithms inflict upon Black digital practitioners. Like other notable scholars, I argue that the computer is an agent and a practitioner of racialized activity, but my approach differs radically in some respects. Did I do that?
No.
So I've been writing on race in the digital for some time now, culminating in the book that was modestly received last year. And I'm super proud of how y'all and the world have received my little book of ruminations. Thank you to those of you who have purchased it. And for those who haven't yet, I have a PDF of the entire book I can send you so you can check me out. Distributed Blackness is not a typical monograph. It should be read as a trajectory, beginning with some of my earliest inquiries into how digital artifacts and services can somehow host Black folks' enactments of self in spaces not intended for them. And it doesn't have a conclusion, a decision which did not sit well with my editors. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is that, one, conclusions are hard. The real reason is that I saw the last half of Distributed Blackness, chapters 4, 5, and 6, as a foray into theorizing the Black digital, something that I felt was missing from the literature of the time. So the second half of the book is driven by libidinal economy, which I've only begun to grapple with as a philosophical framework from which to investigate Blackness. So these 3 chapters on the ratchet, racism, respectability, and the Black technocultural matrix are provocations for you, but also for me, to consider alternatives to deficit models or political motives or racial capitalism as rationales for Black digital practice. For me, these chapters are still drafts, right? I littered them with ideas and concepts about what the digital affords people, mostly Black ones, and Blackness, and these concepts will be fleshed out in some articles and books that I have to write. Today, I'll pick at a thread of this inquiry, my effort to theorize racism as an algorithmic manifestation on social media. And I wanted to do that as a way of understanding the harms that these algorithms inflict upon Black digital practitioners. So if you've read Distributed Blackness, at a certain point in the racism part of chapter 4, I talk about racial battle fatigue, a condition that Black folk online are confronted, have to deal with on a regular basis as they confront videos of Black death at the hands of the state, right? And the effects that that has on the ways in which they understand themselves online and in real life, right? But this is an inquiry that kind of led to that moment that came out of this moment. So I begun offering my audiences a spoiler slide to let y'all know where I'm headed. East North Carolina pollen. I thought I had Georgia pollen in check. This stuff is laughing at my
Something very special here with pollen.
Somebody said the North Carolina pollen is black. I can't really find it. Just saying that.
Well, you didn't mention me in your initial, no, I'm saying.
All right, well, it was nice talking to you.
Oh, I didn't see you there.
Mind you, I was bigging you up to your student all during breakfast. I'm like, yo, you need to talk to me. You need to talk to me. My bad. So here's my spoiler slide. As a rhetorician, I prefer to begin with the theories powering my inquiry, the warrants, if you will. But sometimes you gotta give folks a taste of the product to get them hooked. So this is my money shot. I'll discuss today how social media algorithms, tightly knit networks of Black online sociality, and their internet's of effortless capacity and desire to distribute sensational content lead to the authorless reproduction of racial microaggressions on Black social media, or racism without racism. So I love being able to give this talk to y'all because y'all are my people in many ways, right? Y'all have read Bill Marx and Louis Mumford. If you haven't, it should be. So I don't have to explain technoculture as much as I would have to other audiences. I argue that technology is the American mythos. Vincent Mosco writes that part of that mythos, that affordance that allows it to be widely understood, is elasticity, right? That is a major source of that technocultural power. And this has a dual meaning for digital Blackness. First, digital enacts elasticity as the virtual and as simulation. This is an expansion of the virtuality afforded by older information technologies. For example, where are you when you're having that 6-hour phone conversation with your high school sweetheart? You're at home, they're at home, but you also exist in this virtual space. So virtuality is a concept that predates what we talk about with computers. Right? The digital's elasticity also resides in its capacity to simulate multiple possible virtual spaces through code, multimedia, and computational power. Moreover, the varied meanings that digital practitioners ascribe to such virtual spaces, or have you seen your team play fork knife, right? And by play, I mean they hang out in the house that they built. They don't actually go out and shoot people, they just sit there kicking it, right? Which is a different meaning for Fortnite as a massively multiplayer online game. Instead, it becomes a social space, a virtual social space. So the varied meanings digital practitioners ascribe to such virtual spaces afford even identical instances of code for those of you who are with me in Web 2.0, your subreddits, your blogs, or your PHP bulletin boards, right? And enforce these spaces the elasticity necessary to identify these spaces as heterogeneous in content, yet similar in design. Secondly, the elasticity of technoculture is denied to the natural world, non-whites, and women. Consider Heidegger's contention that the world becomes a standing reserve for technology, rendering its biodiversity as fuel for modernity and capitalism. For whiteness, the elasticity of being both individual and humanity becomes fixity when non-whites enter the picture. Africans and indigenous folk are fixed as primitive, where Asians become spiritual. Right? And this consideration becomes even more complex when one considers that whiteness is limbed, but not bounded by its aversion to and the denial of Blackness. Right? So the elasticity of technoculture, the idea that you can be on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog, right, is always already inframed by whiteness's interpretive flexibility. Less visibly, and perhaps more dangerously, technocultural beliefs promote the appearance of democratic belief about who can speak, who can be heard, but most importantly, who deserves the designation of human on our favorite online and digital communication tools. When you're outside the boundaries of the human, what kind of content or protocols will be used to keep you in your place? So I started here. As I said, I've been theorizing or trying to theorize Blackness in technology, right, or Black technoculture, and any analysis of Western technoculture should include libidinal tension of anti-Blackness, as it is foundational to racial capitalism and to modernity. America was built on the bodies of Black men, women, and children, but also on them as objects of fear, of pathology, of violence, and slavery. Blacks are constantly on the front lines of technical and technocultural fixes to social problems where they are the social problem. Indeed, for many institutions, higher education, policing, welfare state, technology is positioned as the most efficient solution to discipline longstanding social ills exemplified by Black deviants. When scholars first sought to understand information technology by Black folk, and I'm here referencing the digital device studies conducted by the NTIA in 1995, 1997, 1999, 2000, and 2001. This is my dissertation, sorry, I'll never forget that. The Black body was only legible through its perceived absence from the material, technical, and institutional aspects of computers in society. Thankfully, Charles McElwain, his fantastic book, Black Software, has done a lot to address that absence, but it's still, one of my favorite archivists talks about Blacks are legible in the archive through their absence. Right, so Charlton's book does a lot to address that. Hopefully my book does a little bit, but there's still so much more to cover. Distributed Blackness argues that Black folk are natural and expert users of technology. Let me tell you this. In the process, casting them as Black technical subjects and agents. While I could use the 2018 movie Black Panther as compelling evidence for Black technical virtuosity, I instead turned to the first Black author network browser, Mr. Green's Negro Motor Screenbook, which also inspired the recent HBO series. I have this side on the screen, cover that's made up from it, right? Lovecraft Country. As a traveler over America's developing infrastructure, automobile infrastructure of highways, gas stations, rest stops, and crucially, leisure activities, Green was deeply concerned with navigating the context of white supremacist law, practice, and belief through which these roads wind. Right? His vision was to provide Black travelers with a guide to locations where they could rest, refuel, or even relax. And the Green Book was more than a phone book, right, or a catalog, or as I got into an argument on Twitter, more than a AAA triptych, right? It provided cultural metadata about a network, signaling nodes of Black life, right, that Black voters could avail themselves of. Recently found out that the innovation where you now have, what's your store choice here? Y'all Wawa or Sheetz?
Yeah, Sheetz.
So the idea that you could put a restaurant and a fuel station together was pioneered by Black folk in the South, right? Because Black folk weren't allowed to eat at the restaurants in town. So when they could stop at this gas station, the one that allowed them to refuel was a Black woman, right? With their pans of dressing and fried chicken and everything else, food that could be transported over long distances without losing its flavor right next to it. Now you see this spread up all around the country because we recognize that when people stop for gas, they often leave them hungry as kids. What Lovecraft Country adds, I think it's superlative, and I hate that it only got one season, to Victor Green's vision of a distributed Blackness is the monstrous apparition of anti-Blackness, the intersection of whiteness, masculinity. That is where networks are erected ostensibly for freedom, democracy, and commerce, as my good friend Dean Freelon has written. Whiteness also sees them as pathways for domination, coercion, and even violence. And this is as true for technical networks as it was for the US highway system. Or have you ever driven 80 across Pennsylvania? Ain't nothing out there but gas and rednecks. I mean, sorry, racism. I shouldn't say that. So the question I've been working toward that I realized as I was writing this book across my entire research stream is, one, are pathology and deviance the only motives for Black online sociality? And from there, how to understand Black digital practice as productive, and I shouldn't have used that word, life-giving online behavior. So my pursuit of the concept of Black technoculture of necessity depends upon encumbering American society and Western culture with their own practices of white supremacy, situating technical innovation and progress within the often brutal social, cultural, and ideological context in which they began and thrived. I'm theorizing a Black cultural relationship with technology, drawing upon the Black experience in the West, and that's what this matrix on the screen is meant to represent, right? An experience shaped by relationships with whiteness, right? Because cultures operate in coexistence with other cultures that never created, right? But also with our own communities and with technology from a social and political subject position. So there are 6 qualities in this matrix. I only talk about one, but I highlight 2 more for clarity. So Blackness, this matrix, stands for the metaphysical and critical valences of Black cultural identity, revolving around subjectivity and cultural production. And this phrasing does not ignore the political and ideological aspects of Black identity. So I'm not excluding resistance and oppression, but instead I'm highlighting the libidinous elements, the excess of life that drive those aspects of Blackness relationship with the world and with technology. Or as Fred Moulton calls it, the communitarian enactment of intentionality across social aspects of Black culture, or that Blackness is irreducibly social. You may have noticed that I have an asterisk next to modernity, and this is meant to signal that the United States is but one context for diasporic Blackness, or as I was corrected in my last presentation, transnational Blackness. Right? A Nigerian living in Britain has some shared markers of Black culture, but many different experiences. I am an Americanist. Sometimes it's so for my book, Blackness is ineffably American. America as an ideal, as an institution, and as a set of racialized practices is the matrix for the Blackness I discuss in my book. That is, it is well suited as a technological ideal for Black technoculture because America, the nation, created Blackness in order to survive and thrive. Toni Morrison calls this American Africanism. American ideals inform Black community beliefs about equality, democracy, and fairness, even as Black folk live every day based on the understanding that the American telos of progress depends upon the entire. The question, as a scholar of technology, then, is how to understand belief, right, as a technological and technical capacity of information. So I begin from here. Arnold Pacey. There's stuff coming on the slide, I swear, it's blank as fuck. It's good. Arnold Pacey's conception of the tripartite nature of technology. Pacey argues that all technologies have three aspects: technical, organizational, and cultural. Technologies are most often described and understood in the academy, in industry, and in the government, based on the first two qualities, leaving cultural beliefs to implicitly yet powerfully shape our expectations of how those technologies will alter the world and ourselves. Pause. How many of you have Apple phones? These are Android users, I assume? Android users, please describe what type of people Apple iPhone users are. Every time I ask this question, people start laughing. Come on, give it to me, give it to me. You on live stream, you gotta speak up. What type of people are Apple users? Don't be scared now. Don't hide behind the mask.
Snobby.
Snobby. Anything else? Pushy, right? Y'all are being kind, right? My students say they are technologically illiterate, right? Because they don't understand how advanced using an Android phone makes them. Right? And all they do is posture in coffee shops all day. They don't actually work. I actually do work in coffee shops. I don't care what y'all talk about. Right? But I use this example to highlight how beliefs are as much a capacity of how we understand what technologies are and do as the technologies themselves, right? So beliefs are intangible though, right? Even as they help us to make sense of who we are and who they are, we use technology. So to operationalize, because I came from social science and I had to write a book for tenure, to operationalize belief, I turned to Lyotard's libidinal economy. We can talk about that because I get called out regularly because I didn't go all the way back to Jung or Deleuze and Guattari, mostly because I don't understand the French at all, and I just couldn't mess with them. So Lyotard is French, I don't care, okay? I understood him, right? To unpack the tensions, the beliefs, the libidinal tensions, the precognition and visceral reactions powering political economies. And I say that because Western technoculture revolves around the idea that to be the perfect modern subject, you should be rational. Those of you who have read Mumford know what I'm talking about, right? And to refuse to suffuse your cognition with quasi-emotional anthropomorphic subtleties about the world, the facts, just want the facts. But that position is in itself an emotional position. If you are suppressing emotion to think, then that's an emotional position. Does that make sense? Right. So where Ahmed argues that in effective economies, and I love her work on effective economies, particularly when she talks about race, circulating through bodies and structures, right? Emotions play a crucial role in the surfacing of individual and collective bodies through the ways in which emotions circulate through bodies and signs. I turned instead to Leotard's argument that reason and desire are in constant tension. Or did you buy everything in your Fashion Nova basket? Shame. Right? Why not? Because reason and desire fight one another, right? So these political economy's emphasis on rationality and exchange fails to capture the excesses of life to response, right? That infuse, surround, power, and sabotage those exchanges. So what are the libidinal beliefs we can ascribe to technoculture? So this may look slightly familiar in form, liberally borrowed from it in order to do the work I did. This is the original one that I took. This is from Joel Dinerstein's article of 2006, a special issue of American Quarterly, where they talked about technology and culture. Some of you may know it. If you don't, read it. The whole thing is good, right? And this is his technocultural matrix, characterized by 6 beliefs. I know I got 7 categories on the slide. Don't judge me. Progress, religion, modernity, whiteness, masculinity, and the future. I can illustrate that by talking about the attention that was paid even during the pandemic to 3 people: Bezos, Branson, and Musk. White, masculine, and modern, because they're explicitly modern and futuristic because they're building rockets. Large phallic symbols of American and Western technocultural supremacy to penetrate the Earth's atmosphere to reach outer space. We pay so much attention to these private enterprises because there's something about America that loves the idea that those are the qualities that power our moves to space race. At the same time, did you remember that the mRNA vaccine, Moderna, or that a woman actually pioneered the mRNA research 30 years ago that enabled us to have the breakthroughs that allowed us to be in here where I don't have a mask on and you do because I'm vaccinated and booster? Sorry. We don't talk about the women like that. There's a movie that I often call Hidden Fences because it came out at the same time as Fences, but you don't know. Hidden Figures, which talks about the Black women who served as computers for NASA during the space flights. Right? We don't talk about the role of women. We focus instead on the heroic men. Right? This is part of American technoculture. We are invested in the myth of the solitary genius. Elon Musk. Yeah, this white boy with an emerald line. And in the process, so Dinerstein links the West to whiteness, links it. It doesn't go much further than that. And in the process, suggesting that technology works to the benefit of white supremacy and ideology. What I want to do here is drill down into praxis, how anti-Blackness can be quantified and commodified around for capitalist profit and cultural capital. So one set of implicit beliefs about communication technologies, because this libidinal economy, we can drill all the way down. I'm currently trying to write a book for Polity where I talk about the libidinal economy of the digital. Right. So one set of beliefs about communication technology, especially the digital networks we study, revolves around the libidinal tension of comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, right? We believe that the internet is transmitting good sociality if only, you don't do cognitive moderation, sorry, if only we regulate individual behaviors, even as we argue that the overwhelming concentration of meaning and distribution in social networks can lead to the spread of bad thought. For the good sociality, Vincent Mosco writes that we desire to retain our individuality and yet participate fully in a collective community. The bad, mass media technologies have always been susceptible to claims of diminishing or destroying natural life, where natural typically refers to the interests of elites. But these technological myths of comity are understood differently when it comes to race. Before I go that far, arguing for whiteness as only racism does a disservice to the infrastructural and institutional practices and beliefs that characterize whiteness as control. Because control for whiteness is not just about controlling Black bodies, it's also about controlling the bodies of white women and their capacity to reproduce, right? So Cheryl Harris's canonical text, Whiteness is Property, provides nuance to white technical identity, right? By arguing that whiteness is both an aspect of identity and a property interest, an interest which is deployable at the social, political, and institutional level to maintain control, to exclude others, and crucially for the right to use and enjoyment. That last is most important for me in this presentation, as anti-Blackness animates mediums and platforms where only one set of voices is valued, where only one viewpoint is honored, and where an epistemology of ignorance affords whiteness the privilege of ever understanding how racism affects others. For the West in general, but for the United States in particular, anti-Blackness, which I argue is the libidinal economy of racist practice, is as integral to technocultural identity as are the ideals of progress, democracy, and modernity. 2013, Lisa Nakamura wrote that racism on the internet is not a glitch, but a feature. It's foundational. It's not infrastructural to the mode, manner, and meaning of digital practice. Or if you've ever been harassed as a woman, there was a study just posted the other day on Washington Post. So they studied women, including Amber Heard, Johnny Depp's ex, right? They looked at their Instagram accounts, particularly their private messages, because Instagram made the step of saying it was going to actually do more enforcement of the ways in which private messages were used to harass and objectify, threaten, and perform discursive violence against women. Yeah, that's what they found. Instagram did nothing to police those DMs. Nothing. It didn't even enforce the tools that it said or suggest those tools to be. Some women were celebrities, some were not, right? To moderate or mitigate the harms that they were experiencing, it did nothing. 90% of the messages that were deemed in violation of Instagram's code were sent to these women anyway. Not scrubbed, not checked. The users never got disciplined or punished, right? So it's not just Black folk, right? Which is why I think control is important. It's not a certain group. While our gazes are drawn to the extremes of racism and anti-racism, the banality of racist ideology manifests in everyday context for who gets to vote. So the technocultural capacity of anti-Blackness has been deployed to construct Blackness as social debt, slavery, Jim Crow, eugenics, public health, vaccine distribution, social science, criminal law, and segregation, right? And these arrangements reify technoculture, it's how to do things to Black bodies. And so I'm quoting here from Fields and Fields, race as identity breaks down on the irreducible fact that any sense of self intrinsic to persons of African descent is subject to peremptory nullification by forcible extrinsic identification. So repeat that, that's like 17 syllables in a row. Let me try to explain. Forcible extrinsic identification here can be understood as an algorithmic allocation of resources, whether it is engagement, voting preferences, food stamps, mortgage cuts, credit. Right? Race relations as an analysis of society takes for granted that race is a valid empirical data, and thereby shifts attention from the actions that constitute racism. That's what I want to talk about, praxis, right? Enslavement, disenfranchisement, massacres, lynching, and pogroms, to the traits that constitute race. Races in the South. These traits might have once included the Negro's ignorance, laziness, brutality, criminality, subjection to uncontrolled passions, and incapacity for the moral and intellectual duties of civilization. For scholars in our own time who accept race, once ritually purified by the incantation that it's socially constructed, as a valid category of analysis, the relevant traits for racialized people are more likely to be difference, otherness, culture, right? So racist profiling gets euphemized into racial profiling, or racism becomes racially charged. So to sum up this last theoretical thing, right, I'll read the slide. For anti-Blackness is modernity, for the arts and society writ large, anti-Blackness is a non-communicable structural position in society, one that is incapable of being alienated or even understood as violated, because alienation is a quality. For modernity and technoculture, data, anti-Blackness as modernity is data and processes ostensibly proving that communities living outside of normalcy are verifiably outside normalcy. So the recent move by the Biden administration to repeal Title 42, Title 42 is a perfect example of how the US deemed these folk who are seeking asylum legally in the United States could be deported unlawfully back to their countries or to other spaces, right? Because they are outside normalcy. Right? So I write for profit or for governmentality. So discussions of technology tend to avoid, Daniel and I had this conversation a lot. Discussions of technology tend to avoid white privilege or an investment in inequalities of knowledge or access to assess its application across generic contexts that have to be structured by white people. I chose in distributed blackness to explicitly acknowledge that the political economy of racism, mediated by the digital in the form of investment strategies, hiring practices, or algorithmic design, is driven by libidinal tensions between anti-blackness, capitalism, modernity, and thanks to macro politics. Where am I going with this? As an example of the creation of the modern appetite for data and the commodification of blackness, I examined Black folks' discourses in distributed blackness about mundane online racism, where videos of unarmed Black men and women being murdered by police were shared and reshared to their online spaces, their feeds, right? And these videos are mundane, right? They depict the ongoing, enduring influence of anti-Blackness on policing, but we're in a country where 43 kids got shot at a school and we did nothing about it, where 86 people were killed in Las Vegas and another were injured. What's a video about one person getting shot by the police, right? So they're not mundane because of the actions they depict. They're mundane because they're shared as colorblind content. They weren't shared by white folk to traumatize Black folk. In many cases, those videos come down your feed as a brown person because other brown people are like, yo, this is fucked up, look at this, right? Because Black folk tend to see and share content about race more than other demographics, right? These videos quickly dominate their algorithmically constructed and propagated timelines and feeds. They achieve immense visibility through a dumpster fire. I'm sorry, technical term is conflagration. Of algorithmic publication, drawing energy from patterns of online practices, voracious social media feeds driven by venture capitalist demands for engagement and the adding of monthly average users, MAUs, right? And libertarian beliefs that all individuals should be able to express opinions without fear of censorship. That's policy and moderation. In effect, they were experiencing racism without racism, right? And some folk came up with a technical fix, right? That was discursive. They're like, don't share these videos. See it at least once a week on my timeline, right? But I wanted to think past an instrumental solution. I wanted to address the problem head on. So the libidinal economy affords me the capacity to theorize Black encounters with online racism beyond the words and actions themselves. Beyond productivity or commodification, there are underlying tensions that also contribute to the content you see online. These frames in turn contribute to digital practices such as sociality, engagement, virality, content production, and identity formation. In the book, I talked about libidinal frames. And one I wanted to address today is racism. I argue that it has an external influence on Black digital practice. It is the set of external practices, of institutions and beliefs that deprecate and delineate, but do not overdetermine. You'll notice I have a fondness for the triple consonants or alliteration. I came from this part of my training as a reverend, So these things deprecate and delineate, but do not overdetermine Black identity. That is, not every Black activity is determined by the racism Black folk experience through daily or systemic macro and microaggressions. I've been arguing with faculty at Park Atlanta for the last 3 hours that joy does not have to be resistance. They fight me on this, right? Because their thing is, particularly as Black academics, we need to talk about the oppression Black folk experience daily. And I say, what about the joy that's not a resistance? They're like, yeah, that's cool. But we need to talk about resistance. I'm like, but what do? You don't have to resist them. How do you understand it? So what I try to do in distributed Blackness, what I'm continuing to try to do, is theorize, not for this presentation, but theorize how the vivification of life, Black joy, can be understood as digital practice without necessarily resorting to talking about resistance or oppression. So go back to my talk. While the practice of online racism has received online enormous attention, Noble's book, Benjamin's fantastic books, right? The effects of online racism on Black folks have not been as thoroughly researched And I argue in Distributed Blackness that racism implicitly and explicitly calls forth Black interiority, right? Because it encourages you to be reflexive. While the explicit is egregious, if somebody calls me the hard E on the street, that's egregious. I know immediately what's happened. What's more damaging is implicit, the microaggression, right? And the results of that lead to what scholar William Smith calls racial battle fatigue. And this phenomenon is engendered by, as I mentioned, those videos of Black death at the hands of the state, right? If you see them on your feed, babies, and the argument over who's better, Chris Brown or Usher, we already know the answer to that. But in the middle of that, you see a video of Black death, and it happens again, and it happens again. How do you then understand how the algorithm is constructing you as a person? They would say it's your choices that made the algorithm be that way. And I say, no, it's your thirst for engagement, the things that you know I'm going to respond to that would lead to these choices, right? And so it was through this libidinal frame, trying to understand this reflexivity, how it was compelled, right? That I wanted to conceptualize how these practices made it happen. We're back here. Evaluating racism, Black folk must evaluate both the ontology and the epistemology, the what and the why, right, of white supremacy, as well as how it affects them. If you've ever been microaggressed, you will know that many times you will turn to the side to an imaginary interlocutor or to your friends later, like, right? Because you have to question whether that experience, even in itself, was real or was it a phantasm, right? So it compels interiority. You have to re-examine your responses, incident itself, and what you're going to do in the future, right? So microaggressions require daily vigilance to ensure that one's sanity has not been compromised. In online spaces, network libidinal tensions arise from the diffusion of racist and racialized content through social media practice, connectivity, and algorithmic publishing. And I call this phenomenon weak-tie racism, where racism manifests in digital media as forces of sharing information, including but not limited to the content. I also say the science has something to do with science. These microaggressions have no author, right? They are not individually performing. Instead, the algorithm serves them up as a composite of developer and network release of online sociality, leading to microaggressions at scale, or an anti-Black libidinal affect on Black digital practice. As I mentioned earlier, comity is a presumed quality of discourse. That is, people share information in an environment that is presumed to be neutral, if not cordial. Now, I started graduate school when social network analysis was becoming a big thing, right? And social network analysis, which a lot of, like Dean can talk about this all day, right? A lot of research on social media things is shaped by social media analysis. It measures bonds, it measures connections between nodes. It cares not about the content, right? And in part that is because, one, they're not equipped to interpret what the content is, but they were doing organizational analysis. They just wanted to see what positions these people held and how that could facilitate the transfer of information, right? So Granovetter argues that people who have weak-tie relationships with others will kindly offer better access to information that may prove valuable to life circumstances. Presumably, one shares information with folk who have established a shared set of beliefs. Distributed Blackness, I asked, I maybe didn't ask it there, but I'm going to ask it now. In an ideological environment predicated on racial subordination, consider instead that the comity enacted by information technologies draws upon the shared joy or libidinal tension. None writes about this in Effective Economies of Hate, but I'm trying to apply this particular framework specifically to algorithms and social media practice. Right? So through the aggregation of and interaction with hateful content, white and machinic articulations of racism present intimate, intense libidinal tensions bonding the out-group and the in-group. Weak-tie racism is the means rather than the ends, right? Perhaps the best way to describe it is as a hate speech act as opposed to hate speech itself, right? So if you like or you repost a video where somebody's getting killed by the police, is that a microaggression? Right? What does that like mean? You talk about like, no, is it bookmark, right? Is it a mode of affiliation? Is it, right? So they're not microaggressive in and of themselves, although they may denote affiliation or recognition in a social space. It could be counter to one's own beliefs or affiliation. How many of you have hate watched something? Right? And liked the tweets that were talking about hate watching something that all of y'all have watched, together, but you come together in your hatred for whatever franchise you hate on right now. When the aggregation of likes, however, causes one feed to be overpopulated, I would argue once a day is more than enough, by racist content, this demonstrates that weak-type racism occurs through the reproduction of banal social signals deemed important to the service through minute traces of social interaction promoted by algorithmic means. Large part of digital practice is textual and discursive, even as digital visual technologies have become a larger part of everyday communicative practice. I was talking to your fantastic graduate students today, and I was saying, if you're studying TikTok, when you download it, what do you download? The video. What do you miss when you only download it? All the other signs given off that are happening on your phone screen. You miss the interactions that are scrolling up. You miss the chyron at the bottom telling you what content they're using, right? But you also miss the likes and other signals of affiliation that happen on the screen, right? So I say all of these are textual, right? And code occupies some of this textual space, shaping the interfaces, mechanics, and eventually the algorithms and protocols through which digital practice happens. For weak-type racism, the social media algorithms, libidinal intensity is revealed, right? It is the catalyst and weak-type relationship between content and node demanding its own interaction and reciprocity to sustain the relationship between user and network. You're Black and your cousin, uncle, friend, coworker shared a video of somebody getting killed and you like it because you want to bookmark it. Machine just sees that as engagement. And it sees that as engagement because the machine was trained to recognize that anybody should be able to share any content they want, right? But also through metrics of aggregation and virality that Wall Street is demanding that these social media companies find, right? So the reason why Elon Musk is on the Twitter board of directors, even though he violated SEC practices by buying all that Twitter stock, is because Elon Musk has 2-point-something million users, right? He does own Twitter stock, but they probably would have made him a member at some point, right? Because he is deemed more important to the future functioning of Twitter than the banal social signals that we talk about, saying don't post this content to my feed, right? So weak-type racism manifests through digital and online media's affordances for injudiciously sharing information, that is, until the profit motive and white technical identity is considered. Or if you're a woman and you complain about a man harassing you in your DMs, but you first respond to that man by saying F you or go to hell or I hope you die, you will get banned. You will get suspended. And the person who said that rabid shit to you will keep on trucking. Not touch them at all because it is deemed that your affront to their individual expression of free speech, right, is more important than the free speech that they use to hurt you in the first place, right? So this sharing includes, but is not limited to, algorithmically social media content shared in a manner unschooled pre-existing patterns of racism, but also hypervisibility of Black agents. Now, we know that microaggressions can be environmental, a characterization that explains to some extent the virtual spaces in which this racism is encountered. It harms through accretion, right? That is, the text is only experienced in an activity of production. Again, it's racism without racist, right? And Nixon describes this as a slow violence, or a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, and attritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. So I see weak-type racism as a computational manifestation of microaggressions. When one sees a racist tweet, will receive hundreds of thousands of interactions, does the platform's features and affordances of sociality make my cousin's retweet to my family a racist interaction? So what if they're a hotel? The act of liking a video can already be influenced by the already present signifiers of virality, who are more likely to like a tweet or a post that already has thousands of likes or retweets, right? But is correctly not assumed to be in and of itself a racist act, yet its contribution to virality can be understood in aggregate as a contributor to weak-type racism. So how would it reshape our understanding of the internet if we acknowledge that racism and misogyny, but that's a whole different presentation, shapes the design of mundane technology such as social media? Racism, white Americans, provides emotional intensity pleasure, and intimacy. And if, as has been noted elsewhere, Americans have historically shared lynching photos, right, designed financial practices, or otherwise operated from a belief about the subhumanity of Black folk, why would the internet be any different? The internet as an infrastructural implementation of weak-tie communication is capable of racism without racism, given these capacities that I've mentioned over the last few slides, right? But also framed by the epistemological ignorance of the men, mostly men, right, who have designed these tools and protocols. Or did you see the social dilemma? No. Now, I'm wary of technical solutions to online harms, or even incorporating ethics as a fix for the problems of technoculture. We've all seen this, that computer science students get that 1 week of ethics in a class, or that one class that has 120 credits. It's supposed to be. Right. Doctors have a code of ethics to do no harm. The Black women in the U.S. routinely experience the highest rates of mortality and childbirth in the world. Right. So that's not something ethics can address. Ethics is meant, I argue, as a code for risk deferment or professional conduct. Right. Perhaps instead we should be talking about a moral code of harm reduction when deploying complex algorithmic solutions to social problems. Similarly, putting more brown people in the room is not the solution to making algorithmic culture more accountable, right? My students argue that corporations and higher educations have completely eviscerated diversity of all means. Diversity only registers as a plastic representation of bodies, right? We see from Clarence Thomas that having a Black person on the Supreme Court does not mean the interests of Black people will be served. Right, so that diversity, the people in the room, never addresses the complex web of relations, standpoints, and intersections that color, pun intended, decision-making prior to who counts. Instead, if you're going to address this problematic, right, I ask you to consider a praxis of harm reduction. Roger Crooks, Tanya Sutherland, and some other fantastic people argue that instead of centering putative social goods as a rationale for fixing algorithmic culture, instead, let's talk about the centrality of harm, right? Harm is multivalent, it directs attention to individual and collective injury and to responses to threat and wrongdoing. It can be the sacrifice of one human need to serve another equally vital one. So asking maskers, anti-maskers to put masks on to save the community and their kids, right? A demand that we surrender autonomy in exchange for public health. This analysis I present to you today draws from my analysis of harms experienced by Black digital practitioners, rather than an inquiry into the utopian possibilities of information access and democracy. Because powerful systems distribute harms to differently valued bodies according to known historical trajectories of violence, exploitation, and profit. We are always already enmeshed in non-innocent information. Digital traces of people are not equivalent to the people themselves. So while humans made the strategic decision to do so, it's the algorithm that was responsible for the tactical placement of those videos that garnered the most engagement. Similarly for the YouTube algorithm that sends people down the rabbit hole of radicalization, right? Should we absolve the machine of any responsibility in the distribution of this information, right? And I get pushback on this argument because they're like, well, what if they didn't have racism in their hearts? I don't care about the weight of your racist ventricle, like that don't just because you say you didn't have it in your heart doesn't mean the practices or the products that you produce don't then create racism for other people, right? If you talk for harms first instead of goods, you get a different approach to designing these algorithmic processes, this artificial intelligence, right? Or other ways to address inequality through the understand. And this approach offers one way to understand computers' role in reifying anti-Blackness in information online. My mask on, so let me move my mouth.
Once we start asking you questions, you'll need it off again.
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna take water while y'all try to figure out what the
You
hell I'm
take
supposed to do.
water. I am gonna say thank you again so much. I'll let you do questions when we have questions from folks, and I'll just remind people online that if you also have questions, you can send them to citat@und.edu.
You're saying I should go sit down?
No, you also let you do this. You can sit down if you want.
Chair?
Come sit down. We're around like a giant seminar table here. You know how to do this. All right. Well, I'll let you run this. I know you now. You have to call on these first.
My good friend Dean.
If you would like the book or anything here, take a quick shot of the monitor. I'm gonna turn the video or turn the slides off so that our live streamers can see the Q&A better.
So this was a very excellent and interesting presentation. A little light on data for my third case, but great. I love it. I do have a very specific question. I'm intrigued by the notion of weak tie racism. The main thing that it made me think about was the underlying mechanisms. We spent a large portion of the second half discussing. So the underlying mechanisms, which seem to me at first glance, should be very similar to, perhaps equivalent to, those that enable the best of Black digital culture to go viral. So the fact that, Zola is on screens, all over the place where it was. I saw it in the theater, right, in front of sport, right? We all know that many of us know how great top covers are, right? Many of us may know or think they know the definition of the phrase on fleek, right? And so my question then is it really the same underlying mechanism that allows the widespread knowledge and engagement with these products of Black technoculture has also allowed this weak tie racism to go, crazy in the way that it does? And whether the answer is yes or no, is it possible to then design our way out of the bad while retaining those goods?
So to return to the highway metaphor as an information network, was it necessary to build interchanges through urban areas that were populated by Black neighborhoods? Right. However, when you're trying to get through downtown to get to the other side of town, because I find, having lived in Houston and Atlanta, usually work on one side of town and live on the other, right? Do you then enjoy the convenience of being able to cut through town instead of having to take a ring road around? So it's yes, the answer is it's both. Right? For me, the possibilities offered by highway interchanges are covalent the harms offered by these same highway interchanges. So the neighborhoods that were destroyed by those places are still encircling many of those spaces, and so those neighborhoods are incidences of asthma and other chronic illnesses such as hypertension and the like. So should we destroy the highway interchange? I don't know if we should, right? I think that moment passed at this point. Right? But can we interrogate what it means to build a society around the auto? Absolutely, right? So I don't have a solution. What I wanted to do with this particular concept is introduce inquiry into the problematic, right? If you build an algorithm that is designed to promote engagement, regardless of what the content is, right? Then yes, at some points it will work for my routes. Even though we can talk about the liminal tension of how white folks love the actions of Black people. I would probably say everybody want to be a hard ER, but nobody wants to be a hard ER, right? And so you see Addison Rae and Charlie D'Amelio, right, taking up the actions of Jalea Burrell, I think is her name, right? They take up her stuff because they love the excess of life that she gave it, even as they perform it, right? And so she's not getting paid from that information superhighway that comes to her in the same ways they are. But the argument I made to Kieran and Zari earlier is that at some point, though, you have to recognize, if you look at her Triller presence and her TikTok presence, she was posting videos long before she went viral. She kind of wanted to go viral because the kids nowadays think that that's something big. A million views on your video, you're somehow a celebrity at school, right? But also, she's a good dancer. And she takes a lot of pride in her technical skill and her artistic expression. And so for me, the capacity of that network to afford her a space where the barriers of content production have been lowered enough so that she can record them on her phone, share them using a broadband connection, and have thousands of people engage is possible because of those same networks that then will allow people to say that Simone Biles needs to get her hair done instead of in the fall with her kitchens exposed, right? It was a conversation too, right? It's those possibilities coexist, and the problematic is not so much the network itself. It's something that pre-exists the network, our relationship with whiteness and our whiteness relationship to blackness, right? That cannot necessarily be addressed by that, but there should be ways that I pick on content moderation in particular, because that's one way in which it could be addressed, and yet companies are notoriously slow in implementing those things. One, because the human cost to them is high. But they also don't want to pay those contract workers in the Philippines and Greensboro or in Ireland. They don't want to pay for them the experience that they have encountering that explicit, profane, hyper-violent content on an everyday basis. So if you address those harms, then there could be something done about making sure that sociality becomes a social good for all the participants, not just the ones who are most valued by the time. How's that?
Very well, we'll continue this conversation up there. Thank you.
I thought I would have stated that.
Well, well.
Dr. McGregor?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this question sort of builds off Dean's, which is, if we're thinking about harm reduction, right, instead of harm distribution, which has the inequities, right, that you discussed. I worry that we may still fall into this libertarian techno trap, right, that we're talking about, which is identifying what is a harm and who is harmed. Because the man in my DMs says he's harmed, right, if he's blocked, right? And so, like, if diversity and putting people in the room is not the solution, right, to like changing the policies and thinking about whose harms and whose harms are reduced, what other ways can we imagine to understand a more equitable harm distribution so that we can think about harm reduction, right? In the way that you were talking about, that doesn't, because I feel like so many of these things get co-opted, right? Like the whole free speech, right? It's not freedom of speech, right? But so I don't know, I'm just so curious to hear about like, how can we imagine doing that in a way that might not end up in this same trap? You know what I mean? That I feel like we fall in, not we,
Right.
we're perfect. The technology company isn't the way that they enact it.
Right.
I'm just curious to hear.
I feel like you just asked me to solve the complex set of cultural beliefs that populate the United States.
This is what we brought you here for.
So, the problem with libertarianism to me is that it wants to offload the harms that happen through its actions onto a group that is not the people who are libertarian, right? And so if you get some of that influence out of technology design, say by requiring STEM majors to take more than 2 courses in humanities curriculum, right? If you expose them to theories and thoughts about the world and others, I think that's a starting point, right? But also, not that Web 2.0 or 1.0 was perfect, but Anil Dash has recently posted a couple of articles talking about how different our experiences were online. Even then, I would argue some of that was because you didn't know how many Black people there, because they didn't really talk about it, it was just there, right? There's something about that hyper visibility of Blackness, I would argue that kind of sort of coincides with the Obama's administration, right? That has changed the tenor of discourse online, but also in broadcast media, journalism, and other spaces to afford a return to things we our parents as they jeer preaches this group of segregated. Right? We've returned in some ways to that era, right? And so the only way we got them to stop was implementing social and cultural mores, values, and beliefs that it was not good to talk openly about racism to Black people or brown people or women, right? So we had the Equal Rights Amendment, we had all that. Problem is that we then define racism as an individual act of defense rather than a social problem. So perhaps one possibility for the harm distribution instead of reduction is re-engineering our networks to recognize that these beliefs already pre-exist and what steps we can take electronically, algorithmically to shut them down in advance. So we're back to content moderation in a way, right? I don't know if I can answer that. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Francesca Dragoni. Good to see you.
Hey, good.
I had a question about
content moderation. So I want to push back on it a little bit because like a lot of my work looks at how content moderation is actually used to further, repress voices of those who don't get opportunity to talk. And a big thing I think a lot about is like deleted data. And I feel like you're getting at that as well in your discussion of absences. So it's like twofold question. One is like in the imagination of content moderation, how do you like moderate the content moderators? Like if we provide this community of flagging, we know it doesn't work, and yeah, it almost like reinforces that. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about like what the ideal state of content moderation might look like to you. And then secondly, like in a culture where things have to be verified via big data, right? How do we capture the absences in a meaningful way where people can see like this is.
What if the absences, so this is a question to your question, what if the absences are attempts by people to evade surveillance? Right, so one of the first things you'll notice when somebody gets called out for bad behavior in online space is tweets are not loading, right? Or this tweet has been deleted, right? To protect themselves from people further piling onto that moment. So what if that deletion, that absence is a moment of protection? That's something that has to be done. Go back to the first part of your question. I don't know if there's an ideal content moderation. Same thing as I don't know if there's an ideal speech simulation in a speech situation in a society that is predicated on anti-Blackness. I don't know if it's possible. I don't think it's possible anywhere in the world. Everywhere you go, there are prejudices exist. One of the craziest things that boggled my mind in 1993 was two groups of white people, the Serbians and the Bosnians, are fighting each other because one of them was Muslim. I was like, there's white Muslims? I have no idea, right? I couldn't tell the difference between them, but they saw the difference and they fought. So one of the things that human beings do is divide themselves up into groups. Political, ideological, aesthetic, whatever. And so any attempted content moderation, I think, has to be designed to provide policies. I'm going to go policies first rather than technical. Policies that afford groups having possibilities for engagement that don't lead to violence, right? And I think there's violence is a fuzzy word here, right? Because there's discursive violence, there's actual violence, algorithmic violence, and the like, shadow banning and stuff, right? But that's, I think, to me, that's a start, right? But
like, hey, do you think existing content moderation can be formed within the structures that are created, right? Because I feel like the existing content moderation, I'm sorry, everyone just like bounce back, but like the existing content moderation structures are like bound to the system that's been created, which, as you very brilliantly described, is like inside a bubble of whiteness and masculinity. Capitalism, and so that's problematic. And so like, can we create content moderation within the existing structures, or are you more suggesting we need better systems with content moderation thought of in a different
content moderation should not be the afterthought. So I did a brief moment where I was writing technical documentation, right? The actual help documents, and they waited until after they had built it all to ask me to write the help documents, right? That is not a helpful way to write about how your system works. I see content moderation as being that last ad, right? System, they build the system first and then say, oh shit, right? And I need that oh shit moment to be incorporated for the moment you build it, where you storyboard or plan out, how could this possibly affect someone who's not like me? And so design thinking is supposedly doing a lot like that. When I see design groups, they look like the board of directors of Apple or Microsoft, right? And so that whiteness, masculinity, and modernity is something that has to be addressed explicitly. And it's not ever going to be. So I'm a racial realist, right? I follow Derek Bell. I will continue to fight racism to my dying breath while recognizing that it is an unshakable foundation of this modern society that I exist in. Same with sexism and misogyny, right? So at best, we can attempt to erect bulwarks, levees, that will hold back those raging streams or whatever, right? But at some point, somebody's going to find a way to circumvent them or break them altogether. So like Elon Musk joining the board of directors of Twitter, right? Or Peter Thiel, right? On Facebook, and then also funding Cambridge Analytica, right? They will find ways because that's what powerful people do. They find ways to exert power. But in the meantime, we encourage our line workers, managers, and perhaps people who finance, say the development folk here at the university, right, and the investors to all invest in those principles of harm reduction from jump. I think that does a lot to satisfy the question you're asking, right? It has to be a structural response to this structural problem. It's impossible.
First of all, Andrea, I really enjoyed this talk. It was really great getting to see you talk about your ideas as opposed to just me reading them. It's been too long since we got to experience scholars talking about their ideas in person. So I'm going to be a little bit selfish here and ask you a question that pertains to my own project, because I think you have some very. Anyway, so I'm working on this idea of radicalization, of online radicalization, which I think is kind of like a garbage concept and it's useful. And I think one of the reasons I don't think it's useful is because you're telling me that it's radical to be like a white supremacist or just a garden variety racist, which is clearly not, right? But if digital practice, if there's something central about anti-Blackness to digital practice, right? And if a lot of these people who are getting caught up in, I've never read Leotard, I do not mess with theory. So it's like would be like affect, big feelings, right? So it's these people are getting wrapped up in these feelings of resentment and anger and just like whatever, and they're getting the way they feel things. Sorry, I'm not explaining this well at all. But how do we reconcile this, right? Like if we think about the fact that there is this libidinal economy, and then there are these types of feelings that are being engendered by this like anti-Blackness online, and that people are getting caught up in this more and more. I guess I just want to know, can you help me think through that a little bit?
I can try. Daniel and I have had back channel discussions about this. I talked about this with Robert today. For me, the problem with misinformation and radicalization is that suddenly the problem is white people, right? Because the United States and the West in general has carried out massive misinformation, disinformation campaigns to promote its interests here and abroad, right? But suddenly, when it's economic anxiety that produces an election so they don't like, now we. Same thing with radicalization, right? But again, I want to return to the now, right? So the Boogaloo Boys, my brother who is working on white extremist, right? Understood that the American paranoid tradition, and then we talk about the Black one, right, which has existed from this country's inception, right, would find a way to propagate in online spaces. Well, if those online spaces are created to promote that type of information, to concentrate it into these deep abscesses. I'm using that word specifically. Think of a root canal and why you need to get one, right? And these abscesses where they can multiply, attract other people, and continue to share this type of information, then you're never going to be able to get rid of those moments, right? And the ideal public sphere, everybody would have the same comedy and direction towards what the goal of the state is, but you all know that there's no such thing, right? So we can look at Joe Manchin, who has decided that he wants to be king, right, and has completely derailed his party's agenda, right, for fixing the nation because he wants to become powerful, right? And so I don't know if that's something that can be built into our system. Right? I would say though, that going back to that idea about libertarianism, types of information that are available online, if we ask information providers, both network like Comcast and Cox, but also the companies that they purchase, media empires, ABC, Disney, NBC, like if we ask them to become utilities instead of allowing them to dictate their own thing as information providers, which deals them much less scrutiny over consolidation and their actual practices, I think we would find something very different happening. So would you let a utility that provides water to the community serve you poisoned water, saying it's your choice whether or not to drink it? Hell no, you shut them down in a heartbeat, right? So why should we encourage or allow Facebook or other communication infrastructures, because that's what they are now, they're not just platforms. Why should we allow them to afford the possibility of people taking poison water into their hearts and minds? Not saying they didn't already have it already, right? Because a racist on racist, it don't really matter the context, right? But spaces where they can breed is not the right word. Spaces where they can propagate, right? We should not have those spaces be easily afforded to them by the infrastructures that we participate in every day, right? And I think about it in terms of being Black, right? I'm hanging out with my boys in the corner, in the neighborhood, East New York, right? We don't bother nobody. We just 6 Black men hanging out there, shooting shit, burning each other's shoes, maybe passing around a blunt or whatever, right? That presence on the street is seen as poison. The corner is seen as poison and will be legislated and policed against quickly and easily. that same policing and legislation is not afforded to white folk. So that white folk are doing something individual and not harmful, right? So what if we extended past anti-blackness to talk about what it means to have comity in the real, right? To where we afforded people not just harm reduction, but harm distribution. We said, nobody can hang out in the corner, which is not exactly an outcome that I want, because I like hanging out in the corner. Right? But if you hang out and realize that you're hanging out in the corner leads you to wanting to kidnap the governor of Michigan from her home, then we should be able to clamp down on that legislatively, through corporate infrastructures, and through technical means, right? And we're not seeing that. I don't know if we'll see that in my lifetime. I'm not hoping. But it's something we can talk about. This is why I always say I talk about problematics, not problems. I ain't got no solutions. I do like to talk about it, right? And so, but these are ways to think through the problem from a slightly different perspective. But do you all see what I mean about saying that the libidinal part of this allows you to keep those understandings that there are things going on underneath the simple capacity of the network to afford quick, speedy communication across time and space, right? People like to talk to people like them, right? Racism has proven to be a very effective coagulant for the bodies that have come to these shores as immigrants and the bodies that brought other people to these shores voluntarily. Whiteness is the wage, right? And white supremacy, particularly, is how many immigrant communities find a way into the polity of whiteness. So if you find some way to convince people like we did from no, we never did. But just for a moment, we allow Black people, we have Black mayors, we have Black congressmen, we have Black senators, we have a couple of Black judges. If you find ways to try to continue those environments where those things could happen, I think things could change. But you still have to deal with the fact that some people are going to resent me just from their position of power. D'Angelo calls it fragility. I don't necessarily feel it. You have to make some record like that back up. Are we capable? Come on, let's make a graduate student. Come on, Robert. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we have the same game. But when you talk about harm reduction, I think in the context of like Ukraine, you see social media companies banning Russian disinformation and doing all types of stuff, and every time I see them do. So the question, I guess, harm reduction for who? How do we solve that? Because it's not that they're incapable; they're obviously pretty capable. We're seeing it like every day. It's crazy out there, but you know, why can't they do the same thing for the Syrian civil war? Why couldn't they do the same thing for the Black Lives Matter movement? Then, of course, you know, we have a pretty robust. We destroyed ISIS. We said, you know, 8 other people, 7,040 miles, you know, to destroy them, destroy the caliphate. They were terrorists. They're bad people, but yet we can't do the same thing to people who attack the Capitol Hill here in the United States.
They see their cousins, their friends, realtors going into that building on January 6th. They see themselves being able to do that. They don't see the protests 4 weeks before where they were basically lining up tanks and right? Near the steps of the Capitol, they were in full riot gear because they thought some Black people were going to come protest. Right? They don't see those two things as comparable because of the whiteness. So the thing that's of interest to me, and I think people in here have written about it, is that if you look at other countries where Facebook and Google and Apple have a presence, they completely kowtow to that country's policies about cultural content. eBay cannot sell Nazi memorabilia in Germany. Hell, you can't even talk about the Nazis if you're Activision Blizzard in your games. You can't publish a World War II game celebrating the Nazis or having a German sniper, right? Or a Russian sniper up until recently, right? So these countries will allow themselves to be legislated in places where they see that legislation as still affording them an entry into those markets, right? But in the United States, I would argue corporate capture of a legislative mechanism here, right? Plus the considerable mega mergers that have built these corporate effectively stymied any possibility of regulations. The FCC is, right? The FTC is. I hope Lena Khan will be able to do great things, but I'm not really seeing it. And the ways in which Congress has already started to attack, I believe it's called the administrative rule implemented during the New Deal by Roosevelt, where it gave Congress the power to assign powers to the bureaucratic executive, right? Instead of having to write laws that address every particular thing, because they knew those bureaucracies they had constructed were in the moment and could address those things. That's being rolled back too, right? And so is the will here to police the organizations that have now become our community? Will we see a breakup? What was that, 90s? Can't remember. Right, it's a really good question. Will, right, anti-Blackness becomes clear, but not just anti-Blackness, the pursuit of individuality and the goals of a particular segment of white youth. Back to district. What else you got? I got it. Online questions.
I haven't seen one yet,
Okay.
so please.
How much time I got left?
We're still at 7 minutes, so, yeah.
We got 2 minutes to go.
And modernity are kind of like unshakable. You didn't bring up the concept today, but what is their concept of cultural do? Is it just about making do with what we're given? I know with Afro Pessimism, it's kind of like, well, from what I've read, but like Blackness will always be reduced to nothing, so we get rid of the structures that down. What is your
It's a good question. So Afro-pessimism isn't useful to me, even though I find it's intentionally postulated as a fight to resist oppression. To me, no, it's not. It's just a state of mind. It's a philosophical state of being. It's not resistance at all. I just feel like I should be entitled to have the same freedom that I see on network TV that white people have. Right? I want the mopey girl boss stories from a Black perspective. I want the Black loner who becomes a superhero like Reacher. That's like Reacher. I really enjoy Reacher. Can you imagine Reacher with a Black person? How long would he have been in jail? He'd have been in jail the whole 6 episodes. He never would have got out. In the Southeast, in Georgia? Come on now. But I would love to see that. Right? Lovecraft Country was fantastic to me because it was Black speculative fiction, right, in a way that we really hadn't seen. To me, that's Afro-optimism. Right? And so that's a long ass answer to your question, but that captures some of it, not all of it. Good question.
Perfect. Thank you.
I'll say goodbye. Get out your way.
First up, so one more huge thank you. Thanks so much for sharing with us, your expertise with us. Again, if you don't yet have your hands on a copy of Distributed Blackness, we read that as the book club choice last summer for CTAP, and we highly recommend it. It was a great group read, so I know many of you already have. I know as I'm looking out at the room, you are all CTAP and friends of CTAP, and you know as well. If you're watching on the live stream and you'd like to keep in closer touch with the center and our work, you can find us on Twitter at UNC_CTAP. Join our newsletter at ctap.substack.com. Find us online at ctap.unc.edu. Thank you.
My laptop's about to die. Talk about singing for yourself. Good Lord.
Yeah, you back-to-backing those was an ambitious and slightly insane thing to do.